Good evening, and welcome to Woman. Tonight we're going to be talking about children. My guest doesn't believe that children are as happy and blissful as we think they are. With me is Carole Klein. In addition to being author of The Single Parent Experience, and more recently, The Myth of the Happy Child, Carole teaches writing to children in New York and New Jersey. She also teaches social science and writing at Goddard College in Vermont, and she is the mother of a daughter and a son. Carole, when I was reading the book, I must say it was very difficult for me to remember things about my childhood. Do you remember things about yours?
Well, I remember things. I don't remember the feelings.
Yeah,
about
that's
the
what I
things.
meant. I don't remember what it felt like.
Yeah, and it was Freud who used the term childhood amnesia, so I borrow it from him. Just really dealing with that idea that it is very, very difficult to recapture the feelings of childhood because we're not the people we were then. We have grown into and developed into whole other kinds of people. That was a lost part of ourselves.
Also, I think it's not easy to admit that a childhood wasn't terrific. I think we romanticize it a little bit.
Yeah, we do, and I think because we, well, a big part of our society is to mask vulnerability and to keep pains to yourself. Most of us, I think, who were unhappy, even as children, believed that other children were happy, even if we weren't. And so when we look back, it's very painful to admit that it was as unhappy as it was. But I think really much of it has to do with the repressing that goes into becoming a grown-up person.
Why do you think it's important for parents to believe that their children are happy? I mean, we don't just believe it. I mean, we've made a whole... We really believe it. That's right.
For a lot of reasons. Perhaps the most important because in a way it's our own redemption to say, well, we may not be as successful as we'd like to be or as beautiful as we'd like to be, but we do have a happy child, and, you know, by golly, we've made a child who's very happy. And then I think a perhaps more serious reason is that we have been assaulted, really, with a lot of literature and a lot of propaganda in the sense that makes us feel that a mother and father are the sole keeper of this child's psychological health. And so that if the child is not happy, well, then it's something we did. And if a child, so it's no longer a simple thing of a child going through a period where he doesn't feel he has friends or not wanting to play. When we hear something like that, we immediately think, what have I done wrong to raise an antisocial child? What have I done wrong to have a child who has nightmares? You know, we are the person at the center of it. We think, and we're wrong much of the time.
Well, you claim that there are 3 arguments against this myth of the happy child. And the first one is development, is that?
Yeah, that in a sense, yes, I do make that position. The first is that a child is in process. And he's becoming, he's not being, he isn't yet. And when you're becoming and when you're in process, you don't have stability. You know, this is just a truth. And I think one of the difficulties is really, and the ironies, because we do want to have such happy children, is that we make a demand on our child that is absolutely so unreasonable, considering his undeveloped nervous system, central nervous system, that here we are feeling sad and lonely and frightened with a fully developed nervous system, and the child who is still in formation, we expect to have better control over their feelings.
We don't connect,
than we do.
though, our feelings with theirs at all, do we?
No, we don't. We don't. We look at, well, we don't even look at them as separate people, but we don't make that connection between a small pain and a large pain. And I think we have this idea that you line up in size places for psychic pain, and we don't. I mean, you can have, it can be as traumatic and as tragic, perhaps is the better word, to have a teacher make you feel silly as for a boss to fire you. And that may be hard to grasp when we're grown-ups, and we have a tendency with all the love and well-meaning in the world to say, oh, come on, it's not that important to a child, because we're applying a grown-up yardstick to the pain.
The other is dependency.
The other is dependency. The second is dependency. And again, a child, because they are in process, mentally and physically, is totally dependent on somebody else, you, the mother or father, to take care of them. And it's very nervous-making to be dependent. Any of us who have been in dependent situations, I make the parallel when I teach women, adult women, that there are, and it isn't unique to me certainly, that there are great parallels between what a child feels and what a woman feels emerging into autonomy. And to move out of dependency is very frightening, and for a child to always be conscious that he needs somebody else to take care of him or her makes you very uncertain and very frightened much of the time. And children, the book is divided into chapters about feelings. And for example, I have a chapter on anger. Children are terrified of their parents getting angry at each other, let alone at themselves. And a mother's simple scolding to a child can make a child terrified because they need that mother so badly. I asked one little boy, as I remember, what's the worst thing that ever happened to you? And he said, going down the escalator with my daddy in a department store and then looking and seeing it wasn't my daddy. Well, how long does it take to go on an escalator in between floors? But those few seconds, really, were terrifying to him. Why? Because he knew very well if he got off that escalator, he was 5, and his father wasn't there, he couldn't get home by himself. And they're conscious of this all the time.
It's a little bit sad.
It's very sad,
Yeah.
but it's real.
It's funny, too.
It's funny in a kind of poignant way,
Yeah.
but it's real. And if we tell a child, oh, don't be silly, what we're doing is driving that kind of feeling underground and making a child feel ashamed of being afraid, which is much worse than being afraid.
How does the fact that, we're into the age of the nuclear family affect this kind of dependency?
Very much. It's a very good question, because a child has only 2 people to be secure with, and more only one person full-time, as the marriage and family changes. And a child, it was Margaret Mead who I think said that the nuclear family is the worst thing that ever happened to a child, because they know very well that if somebody walks out, 50% of their security is gone, which is very different. I mean, I think she says a child should have 30 people to trust and be secure with. Well, when you have 2 people, it makes it very alarming to lie in your bed and hear those 2 people quarreling. Children are very, very worried about that.
The third argument against the myth of the happy child, cognitive confusion.
Cognitive confusion, which is a rather heavy term, but
It is.
really, I couldn't find a simple way of saying it, relates to the idea that the brain and the intellect, as well as the body, is still in development. So a child, put more simply, a child very often is asked to do things that they have no understanding why they are being asked to do it. I mean, we are all guilty of saying, just do it and you'll understand why later. And in simple and larger terms, a child is being asked to repress instinct in order to be socially acceptable. Share your toys, don't eat with your fingers, don't be fresh to the teacher, don't complain when mommy goes out to work. All of these things that they know they must do to keep approval, but they have no clue yet. They do not have the conceptual thinking of why they're supposed to do this, which really means operating a great deal in the dark, which makes you very confused.
You mentioned teacher.
Yeah.
What
I did.
What role does a school play in this?
It plays a tremendous role.
Is it positive in any way?
Well, in any way, yes. In many ways, no. If they're lucky, it can be a good force. But in studies that have been done on children in school and the relationship of the school experience to a child's self-concept, overwhelmingly the school comes out as a negative factor in a child's
You
self-concept.
hear many parents say, I'm going to be very sorry to hear him or her go to school because the child will not be a creative person anymore, but it's more than creativity, isn't it?
Oh yeah, there's Oh, I mean, it's a huge subject. Yes, creativity is lost very often, but the self is often repressed and suppressed. And I have a chapter in the book on shame, and shame is taught in our schools. Many teachers will use shame as a way of discipline in school.
Give me an example.
Well, I have a child in my book who, although I interviewed great numbers of children, I have about 10 children, I think, who were kind of archetypes of kinds of children. And this one little boy, Robert, who is brilliant, but had the slow muscle development of many children, because one of the other problems is, and schools are very guilty of this, of having a standard child, your standard 5-year-old. There's no such thing. I mean, development is individual. Well, anyway, Robert, who was brilliant and could read and think like an adult in many ways, couldn't tie his shoes in kindergarten. And it was written in this teacher's idea of kindergarten that a child should know how to tie their shoes. And she had a child come up, another little girl, if you want to know what causes the trouble between the sexes, a girl come in, and Robert sat here like I'm sitting here, and this girl came up to tie Robert's shoes while all the other children had been instructed to put their hats and coats on to go out and play. And the teacher very negatively said, Robert has to have his shoes tied because he's holding us up from recess. And so this little girl came up and tied his shoes while he sat there on display to giggling kindergartners. And the teacher humiliated him. Well, this little boy went home, and his mother was beside herself because he spent about 6 hours trying to learn to tie a shoe, skipping a meal, getting perspiring, unbelievably frustrated. He learned it. He learned it at a tremendous price, to his self-concept. And the mother had said to him, don't be silly, you'll know how to tie your shoes by the time you go to college. And I think what I say in the book is, in that moment, Robert never believed that he would be smart enough to go to college. And it's a very good tool of discipline for a teacher, to make a child feel ashamed of the judgment of his peers.
Kids have to ask permission for everything.
They
go to the bathroom, to get a glass of water. And they even have to convince people they're not feeling well.
Yes, to go to the nurse.
Right.
I mean, that sense, that's a very important issue. The sense of losing ownership of your body outrages children. The idea that a child can raise their hand and say, can I go to the bathroom? The teacher says, no, wait till recess.
I know.
And they say no all the time. And you're sitting there squirming and feeling physically so uncomfortable. It makes children unbelievably furious, rightfully so, and ashamed of their own bodies. And what can they do? They can't say anything to the teacher. They have absolutely no authority in that classroom.
And no recourse, because they'll go home and tell their parents, and their parents will imply that the teacher is always right.
Or they say, well, it's your job to get along there. That's another, I think, a very interesting point, that we tend, as independent as we may think we are of authority, there's a tremendous pull to have your child fit in. It's very hard, as individuals you think you are, to have a child be an outsider. And the most autonomous parent will say, well, look, you should learn how to get along with the teacher. And after all, I mean, she's the one in charge, and you have to learn how to get along with people in charge. So we rarely support the indignities that take place in the classroom, and they are indignities.
It must be awful to go through life, a young life, every day, and not be sure what's expected of you. To have to weigh every single move almost.
And you don't know. I mean, and is this going to get approval? And they're approval seekers. This is how we learn it. We need permission, we need approval, and we have to fit into somebody else's idea of what we should be in order to win that approval. This is why you find children losing the creativity that you speak of. When I ask children to write, for example, the minute they're past 5, and they're saying, how many words to a page? Do I write in pen? Do I write in ink? Does spelling count? Can I erase? You know, you can't be very creative if you're going to be worrying about all
Right.
these rules. And this is what they are so worried about. And a more serious thing happens in which they begin to distrust their own instinctual desire to sit down and put something down, because is the teacher going to like what I put down? And so
Right.
I better just psych her out and see what it is she wants, which is what happens.
It's amazing, I think, that anyone survives.
Well,
I mean,
not
how
too
do
many
we
of
all-
us have done
That's
very
true.
well.
That's true.
You know, and I think one of the reasons I wrote the book is that one of the great problems of our adult age is identity crisis. Who am I really? What do I really believe? Also, that older children, when you see college-age children, are having this enormous problem of being able to cope with the demands of the outside world.
Do you know statistics about what percentage actually of children seek professional help?
I
Mental
have it
health
in the book.
type.
It's a tremendous percentage. The period of like 1965 to 1960 to 1970, an enormous escalation of children who have.
Now, is that
and
because of a sophistication on the parents' part, do you think?
to a degree, yes, and an availability of help. But there's no question that while it's been always difficult to be a child, it's more difficult today, and children are having much more problem in coping. The stresses are much greater.
I think they're also greater on the parents,
They are greater in the parents.
especially the kind of parent. We know there are more single parents now than ever before, and there are more women who are heads of households now. The strain on that kind of parent is tremendous, I'm sure.
It is, and you do, well, the single parent and the parent who's working and the mother who is trying to define herself in new ways finds it very difficult. In a sense, we're all kind of living marginally. We remember the mythical mother or the mother we would like to be, and here it's very difficult to be all things to your child and still be something to yourself. So there's a lot of guilt on the part of the parent, and parents feel, again, this what did I do wrong idea. So there is a need to go and get outside help, and I think to liberate yourself from the idea that it's all your fault. And I want parents to understand that there's so many influences on a child's life that you have nothing to do with. Children are tremendously, you can measure mental health and stability by the rate of social change. And the rate of social change today is enormous. So children are, by definition, much more disturbed and stressful than they were before. There's a statistic I don't have in my book, but there's a rising incidence of the kind of illness we can call psychosomatic in children. And I'm not just talking about asthma. I'm talking about ulcers and hypertension, where very young children, 7, 8, are having high blood pressure. And
High blood
pressure. And it's really astounding. And the rate of ulcers in children is growing greatly. And there's no question that this relates to the kinds of stresses that they are feeling, one of which is the repression of their feelings, because they are afraid for some reason to admit to the stresses that they are feeling.
Well, is anyone doing anything about this?
Well, I hope I did, to some extent. Is anybody? Yes, I think there is a movement. There is a movement within schools. We have a great growth of alternative schools. There are child advocates. There is a child liberation movement. And I think there is an attempt to understand that childhood is a time today that needs a great deal of support, and support in a way that means we have to redefine what it means to be happy and what it means to grow up. And we have to understand that growing up no longer means having all the answers, which makes parents unhappy. I want to tell my child, I can tell you how to be a successful person. It doesn't mean that anymore. It means I can tell you maybe how you're going to grow into yourself enough to cope with whatever unknown comes along. So I think there is an attempt in therapy and in the edges around school systems to understand that the old ways are not working, and we just better be flexible enough to come up with new ways, and one of which is there's a rise in family therapy. I mean, that's a direct outgrowth of what we're seeing in children. And family therapy, multiple family therapy, to go back to your question about the nuclear family, where a child can see that while this is one way in his family, it can be another way in another family, and that's okay, too.
Do you think it's also important for the individual parent to realize that a certain amount of emotional trauma is normal?
Oh, I think it's very important.
I think there's nothing more upsetting for a parent than to see a 14-year-old or a 15-year-old sitting in a chair
Depressed.
staring off into space.
Yeah.
And it's an incredibly upsetting thing. And most of us feel helpless in the face of that. And guilty.
And very guilty. And I think that we must begin to understand that if we can be depressed, our children can be depressed if they weren't depressed. And one, if they weren't depressed, I mean, you'd have to worry about what they're taking in of life. I mean, how realistically are they seeing life? Two, I think, and know that you pay your dues at some point, you know, and that if you are going to run interference for your child constantly, and were you able to, which you're not, keep a child from ever knowing depression in childhood, you would be raising a child who could not handle it in adulthood when it would be there. And the studies have shown that children who were freaking out in serious ways in adolescence, and to the extent that some of them are committing suicide, you know, the ultimate.
The statistics are very high.
Very
the
high.
second largest killer of children
Yeah,
other than accidents?
Other than accidents, yes. And adolescent suicide is the greatest period.
What is the age span? Do you have any idea?
Well, I record suicide attempts in my book from age 8. But the biggest incidence is in early adolescence, and then about 17 or 18 when they go into college. First and second year of college are very, very strong periods.
And that's increased tremendously.
And very much on the rise. And something curious happens in that. Part of the, one of the sad things is that not too many of the suicide that are successful, that's what you can call them, these people don't leave notes behind. And the dynamic in the suicide is thought to be loneliness. Children feel very, very lonely, and one could speculate that the reasons that they don't leave notes is because they don't think anybody really cares, even in that last message, to hear what they have to say. But research into adolescent suicides show that it very often happens at a time when a strong relationship ends, that these children feel nobody understands them. And then they find this one love. And sometimes it's the same sex, it's a good friend. But very often it's a boy for a girl or a girl for a boy. And when that relationship breaks up, they feel that nobody is left who understands them.
Don't you think it's not unrealistic when the individual parent feels totally helpless in the face of all this?
Really helpless in what way do you mean?
To do anything to change, either at school or, you know, with the child?
Yeah, I do. I think that you can feel helpless.
I mean, is there anything that you can say, all right, do A, B, and C, or watch out for A, B, and C?
Well, I think what we must do is accept the fact that it's tough to become a person. And that if we can accept it, we can allow our child to accept it too. And you can't say to your child, the world is not a trouble-free place, which I think in our desire to protect them from, quote, the real world, what we're doing in this sense is making them inadequate to live in the real world. So I think what we can do is liberate ourselves and at the same time our children from the feeling that it is tough, you know. And once we do that, then we can allow the child the freedom to accept their own feelings. And I think that we don't have to have answers for our child. And I think that's where we get hung up. We want to say to this child who is depressed, do this and you won't be depressed. More importantly, perhaps, is to say to a child, yeah, it's awful to feel that way, you know, but we all do, and maybe I can help you this way, that way, and this way, but that's part of the human experience, and you'll cope with it. and you'll be able to cope with it. And when they do, I use the analogy in my book of thunderstorms. A very young child lies in their bed, in their crib, and they hear a thunderstorm and they're terrified because they think they're going to die. It's going to kill them. An older child is still afraid, but isn't so afraid because they know they've lived through enough thunderstorms to know it's not going to kill them. The same thing can be said about feelings. You know, that if you're depressed, when you come through it and you see, yeah, enough time went by and now I feel good again, the next time it hits you, you won't get so worried about the feeling that you'll go under with it.
Carole, thank you.
Thank you.
We're out of time.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching, and good night.